Welcome back. You're watching Power Talks. We're in conversation with Mr. Salil Shetty, the director of United Nations Millennium Campaign. Mr. Shetty, it's a contentious issue, but we must talk about it. It is heavily debated that foreign aid is counterproductive and it contributes to corruption. What is your opinion on this?
Well, I think, aid, we've had a mixed experience with aid. It ultimately depends on how it's used. I don't think aid in itself can corrupt or is insulated against corruption. I think it could go either way. It depends on how you use it. Because, the corruption question is independent of who is funding, because even if it's domestic resources which are being used, if you have a system where there are no clear rules and there's not enough transparency, and there's an ethics deficit in the country, then there's going to be corruption. So I think it's quite independent. But I agree that there is one issue in relation to aid which creates a bit of a problem with aid, that the leaders who are the elected leaders, if they are not getting the financial resources through tax revenues from their own population, it is true that then they become less accountable to their own people, because they are accountable more to donors. And this we have a history of seeing this in many poor countries, that instead of listening to their own people, they are busy listening to the donors. So this is a problem which we've seen. But certainly in relation to the Millennium Development Goals, we can give you enough examples where aid which is properly used has contributed significantly to the achievement of the goals. Bangladesh, Nepal and this part of the world are good examples where things have moved forward, and aid has, I think overall, where it's been used properly, has been helpful. But as I think we said earlier, you have the Paris Declaration, you have the Accra Agenda of Action. All of these are moments and forums at which donors have made some commitments on how they're going to improve the quality. They'll be more harmonized, they will give enough kind of focus on national priorities, but we still have a long way to go. Some donors are notoriously bad, and once you don't actually follow the national systems and processes, then you are further increasing the risk of corruption and exposing yourself to all sorts of issues. So I think that there are big issues in front of us. But for the goals, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, one of the major reasons why the goals are we are struggling with the goals in several areas in several countries is because of poor governance, lack of accountability and corruption.
In the same context, there is something that I have noticed, that it's become a global trend that the local NGOs shift their objectives in accordance to the change in funding policies of the United Nations and donor agencies. Has the UN noticed this act of cleverness and double standard that has led to giving a birth to probably a global intellectual mafia?
I haven't quite thought of them as a mafia, but I mean, in the sense that I can see that fashions and trends do, shift priorities. Now, I mean, overall NGOs are a very small part of the story. I mean, because most of the aid flows government to government. That's where the big issue is. So the big problem we have is where governments themselves are not clear about their priorities. And I mean, you take a country like Rwanda or Mozambique, which are two exceptionally good cases, where the leadership is very clear about what the country's vision is, the people are very clear, they're moving ahead, and they tell the donors this is what we want to do, and then the donors have to support that process. And the NGOs and other actors, once you have a clearly defined national development plan, which is based on the Millennium Development Goals but adapted to the local and national context, then it's clear, we're all moving in one direction. Where we are not clear ourselves, then we jump, somebody says jump, then you jump in one direction, tomorrow you find, today climate change, yesterday Millennium Development Goals, tomorrow PRSPs, but that's all fine, but what do you want to say as Nepal, forget about all of these other ideas, So yeah, I mean, there is a problem, but I would say that it's not restricted to NGOs alone. So.
You have extensively worked in South Asia, and based on the 8% GDP growth of India and China, do you see a rosy picture for South Asia?
No, I think the fruits of the growth, both in India and China, and I think that obviously has had certain impact on the neighboring countries. We've seen the positive fruits and the positive gains. I don't believe that income poverty would have gone down as much as it has in the last decade if we didn't have the kind of growth which we saw. But we have enough experience to show that if you have a high economic growth, it doesn't mean economic growth for poor people. It doesn't translate into improved incomes for poor people. So which is why in all of these countries, while we've seen reduction in income poverty, we've also seen significant increase in inequality. I mean, you've seen the case of Nepal, the Gini coefficient has significantly gone up, which is an index of growing inequality. And I always give the example of the human body. So if you have a situation where only your nose is growing or your ear is growing, you would have to go for surgery. So you can't have only one part of the country, the elite in Kathmandu, say, benefiting, or the cities in India. I mean, you've seen the lifestyle of the rich in India is equivalent to the lifestyle of the richest people in the world. So they're physically in South Asia, but they're equal, they're as good or as bad as anywhere in the world. But you can't sustain this, with the high levels of inequality, and will lead to social tension and conflict. You're sitting on a time bomb. So economic growth, I think, is important, but it's not an end in itself. It's a means, and the end has to be improved lives for all citizens, and particularly since you mentioned South Asia. We have a big problem in South Asia because we have, particularly India and Nepal share a certain religious tradition, etc. And that tradition has ended up keeping society deeply stratified, and the people at the top end of the society have captured most of the benefits. And even in Nepal, you're seeing the tension, now, as those who have been historically excluded for the first time have some voice. And they're raising that voice in a somewhat chaotic way, So because there have not been any avenues to have structured participation, you're like opened, suddenly, as if the box has been opened, and so you're seeing an explosion of voices and historical frustration. So we are hoping that, we've learned from our past, but as we move forward to 2015 to achieve the goals, those goals will be achieved in an equitable way. Because it's not people from rich households who are dying during childbirth or suffering. Half of Nepal, for example, is suffering from child malnutrition. Now, those are not from the rich households, from the upper caste households. These are the Janjatis, the Dalits, the poorest people, and women. Women are at the bottom of the pile in South Asia, and as a result, all the goals which are related to women are suffering. You can see that. It's okay. It's very good that we have 1/3 of the women in the Constituent Assembly, but it can't be a token representation by a quota. We're talking about women's empowerment, which has to be comprehensive. So